Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Anna, as well. There is something I know about outdoor Shakespeare, Shakespeare in the park, Shakespeare in the garden, Shakespeare in the open air, that might not always be to everybody's taste. At times it can seem a bit too much like Shakespeare as a cornerstone of the culture industry, rather than an urgent or positive intervention in the cultural, artistic, or political life of a community. It's more about cheese platters and picnics than an engagement with ideas, more champagne than pathos. But Sport For Jove's annual trip into the Blue Mountains transcends, I think, these expectations, not usually or necessarily in a loud way, but subtly and with their typical commitment to telling the story of the plays that they perform. As somebody who lives in the mountains, who might be checking his phone all night to see if the trains might get back online, this has become a very welcome annual ritual for my partner and I, and not because it's a pleasant social occasion, although it is certainly that, but because it really does feel like a part of the rhythm and the life of our neighbourhood. I'd encourage people to come along if you've never been at the start of the year. Maybe check the weather. It can be a little bit dicey at times. One of my favourite moments was 2 years ago during a performance of As You Like It, I think, when the rain was so heavy. It was one of those mountains nights where it wasn't raining on you, but you were at one with the rain. So hard that all of the electrics went on the fritz. There was no sound, there was no music. The players carried on, but they looked like they were about to die of exposure. But usually it's a really good night, thoughtful, smart and engaging theatre. In 2024's season, though, something shifted when our speaker for this evening, Margaret Thanos, launched her production of Thomas Middleton and William Shakespeare's play Timon of Athens onto the manicured lawns of Lura's Everglades, renaming the play in the process rather wonderfully as I Hate People or Timon of Athens. Wearing its political engagements on its sleeve and platforming some truly compelling performances, urgent, high-octane, and about as far from the polite world of Prosecco and Camembert as you could imagine. This was always going to be an interesting choice of play to perform in what was its first ever professional performance in Australia, which is making history, and in Laura, fantastic. Timon, for a Shakespeare scholar like me and a teacher like me, is already a fascinating document. It's a collaboration between two writers, really interesting points of their career. Shakespeare was writing King Lear in the same year that he was collaborating on Timon, and Middleton was really just getting started on what was going to be an incredibly prolific and successful career, mostly known for writing acerbic and really caustic critiques of contemporary urban life in plays that get called city comedies, not at all the type of play that Shakespeare could, I think, turn his hand to. To give you a very small flavour of what Shakespeare's collaborator was doing, so at the very time that Shakespeare was writing Lear and collaborating with Middleton on Timon, Middleton was also writing a play called A Trick to Catch the Old One. And a bit like Lear, it's about holding the failures, the economic and social failures of an older generation up to close scrutiny. And there's a defining scene towards the end of that wonderful play where a grotesquely greedy moneylender called Harry Dampit, Middleton does a fine line in names, is drunk and bedridden, and he's wheeled out on his deathbed onto the stage. And characters imagine him being chained to his bed like a devil in hell. And one character describes him like this. He says, "Here he lies like a noisome dunghill, full of the poison of his drunken blasphemies, and they to whom he bequeaths all grudge him the very meat that feeds him. Here may a usurer behold his end. What profits it to be a slave in this world and a devil in the next?" Energizing as this level of invective against greedy capitalists might be, and that's Thomas Middleton's stock in trade, is kind of attacking people who exploit others for greed. It's hard to square, I think, with Shakespeare's typical approach to suffering, which is almost always suffused with pathos, even for those who might not deserve our pity, Richard III on the battlefield, Richard II in his prison cell, or Lear himself. The task of Timon is to hold those worldviews together, a profound awareness of the nastiness and corrupting effects of individual greed, together with an equally profound empathy for human suffering. To my mind, the play Timon of Athens absolutely manages to pull this off. It's an astonishing play. I teach it whenever I can, that should be performed much more often. But I imagine that it's an incredibly hard task for a director and a company to pull this off. With Margaret's clear-eyed and very contemporary vision, and with Sport For Jove's commitment to engaging its audiences, then the challenge was more than met by this brilliant production. And a production which is being revived in the Seymour Centre for a week in June. Please go. It will be well worth a night of your time. In the meantime, though, I'm very excited to hear from that production's director. Margaret Thanos is cutting an exciting career for herself as a major contributor to Sydney's theatre. Her Timon was described by the Herald as the pinnacle of Shakespeare in Sydney. More recently, her adaptation of Aristophanes' A Parliament of Women, which she also brilliantly renamed as Not Now, Not Ever, received comparable accolades, performed as part of Belvoir's 25A season, a season dedicated to rising talent in Australian theatre. Margaret is clearly developing a very welcome line in politically engaged revivals of marginal older texts. Shakespeare-wise, in the last year, she also directed a play-in-the-day version of King John for Bell Shakespeare. And she marries her theatre work with crucial public activism and writing on critical issues of gender equality and the climate crisis, and particularly dealing with the need to include marginal voices in our public discourse. I urge you to give a keen ear and a very warm welcome to this year's Shakespeare Memorial Lecturer, Margaret Thanos.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction. Hello. I want to start by also acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today we're going to talk about Shakespeare and the Western canon, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves before we begin that there is a much older history of storytelling that began on this land and that we are privileged to be on tonight. The First Nations people of this country have been telling stories for thousands of years, and by getting to be here telling stories, we are an extension of that practice. I am eternally grateful to tell stories on this land. The original production of Timon was performed on Gundungurra and Darug country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Hi, my name is Margaret Thanos, and I am the director and co-adapter of Sport For Jove's Australian premiere production of I Hate People, or Timon of Athens, that is having a rebound season in the Seymour Centre this year, in only a few weeks' time. I am so excited, as you can see. I'm also a resident artist at Belvoir Street Theatre, and all I know how to do is tell stories. When I first met Damien Ryan, the artistic director of Sport For Jove Theatre Company and one of Australia's finest Shakespeare minds, pictured above, I told him that Hamlet was my favourite play of all time. This was, and I'd hazard a guess always will be, true. But what I didn't tell him was that I never wanted to direct a Shakespeare and honestly couldn't imagine anything worse. Which was true at the time, but you don't tell that to someone who's dedicated their entire life to it. Despite me knowing that Hamlet was the utter peak of playwriting, I never ever wanted to tackle Shakespeare. It was quite the love-hate relationship I had with it. I've directed all kinds of works, new takes on classics, contemporary classics, new work, and contemporary international writing, but until January of last year, I had never done a Shakespeare. In my bygone acting days, I performed in a bunch of it, but as a director, I just didn't feel hungry for it. Shakespeare's work felt like majestic but intimidating fortresses, built, let's be honest, on pillars of privilege, white, male, patriarchal. I'd of course been taught them at school and had hallowed memories of 9 a.m. English classes on winter mornings where no one volunteered to read any of the roles except for me. I just I didn't know why these plays were relevant. I didn't get it. I didn't know why my generation, the Gen Z, as we are called, and we have in this room tonight, which I'm thrilled about, should give a hoot. So how does someone who never wants to direct Shakespeare and thinks performing it might be completely irrelevant end up premiering the first professional production of Timon of Athens that Australia has ever had? Mostly just too much wine. No, I'm kidding. I stumbled across Timon of Athens when an ex-boyfriend of mine gave his own adaptation to me to direct, and I thought it was interesting enough. I mostly agreed to do it out of politeness, that special kind of politeness that you only find when you're inside a relationship desperately trying to impress the other person. Alas, that production and my relationship was cancelled by way of COVID. But when I picked up the script again, while going through old memories of that relationship gone by, I know, I was utterly struck by this play. This so-called problem play was a masterpiece. It had some of the best speeches of Shakespeare I'd ever read in it. It was utterly glorious, and yet it was unfinished. I got to the end of Shakespeare's text and basically threw it against a wall. What? He just dies? That's the ending? So I put it away, content that I would never have the hunger to work on a project like this, particularly now that that relationship was over. Then, right before I met Damien, I went to see a production at the Globe Theatre in London of another obscure Shakespeare that had some of the most baffling choices I had ever seen on a stage. It made me angry. I won't name names, but I was watching some of the most glorious text in existence being utterly defiled by a director's complete lack of taste, all on the Globe stage. Shakespeare would be turning in his grave. It made me livid, and then it made me scared. Did I care about Shakespeare? I recall that one night, probably over a glass of wine, I told Damien that I was crazy about the play Timon of Athens and that I wished someone would do it. I genuinely didn't mean me. I just wanted someone to bother. We chatted endlessly about the problems inside the play. Why is it so cynical? Why doesn't it have an ending? Who actually wrote it? And what does it really mean to do it now? Timon is one of the only plays to have no clear record of performance during Shakespeare's era. Its first appearance in print was in the 1623 folio. Sometimes I chuckle at the idea that it's an unfinished draft that somehow made it to the printing press, and I imagine all the living playwrights that I know who would rather die than allow that to happen to some of their drafts. It's oddly comforting to think that Shakespeare might have had a script that he never meant to share, and horrifying to think his friends were the kind of people who would publish your messiest Google Doc after you died. So the next time I saw Damien, I ended up bringing a PowerPoint of an idea. It was just an idea. I really wasn't going to do it. Some would have called it a pitch. I mostly thought it was a Pinterest board to entertain a colleague. I truly never thought we'd actually do it because it doesn't seem like people would want to buy a ticket to it. A Shakespeare piece that's never been performed in the post-COVID era where theatre has to become more conservative than ever. No. I knew this was a pipe dream. Not to mention, it's no secret that Timon can be an incredibly difficult production to pull together. As I said, it's unfinished, written by more than one writer, and is notorious for its complete lack of women and continual plot repetition. And I still was holding on to the idea that I didn't want to do Shakespeare. Damien, however, saw an idea and we ran with it. At the top of this speech about this particular production of Timon of Athens, I do need to say that it is only Damien's bravery with allowing his company to tackle this show that has given me the freedom to be standing here before you explaining why feminism and boldness is required to bring the life to the canon of Shakespeare, particularly his most obscure plays. Thank you to him for also playing Timon with all the heart that this character deserves. So Damien, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Okay, so we were doing it. Fuck. But I didn't just want to do any version of Timon. I had to mess with it, Thanos style. Okay, so what really struck you, Margaret? Was it the language? No, not just that. I will say something now that is totally bold, but if I wasn't saying the bold things, then it wouldn't really be me. For my money, Timon of Athens is the most relevant and contemporary Shakespeare play we have. It is centuries ahead of its time. It is about now. So what makes it so relevant? Well, you see, at its core, this show is a simple fable. It's a warning against what can happen when the forces that govern a city are imbalanced. The instability that is left at the end of the play feels truthful to so many failed states today. And yet, amongst all of that, it is an advertisement for the wonderful nature of life. Timon is yet another testament to Shakespeare's extraordinarily subversive temperament. Just as its titular character rejects the basic social currencies that bind people together, the playwright rejects the usual tools we rely on to feel something in a story. The result is a play that completely refuses sentimentality. It doesn't comfort the audience, it confronts them. Damien pointed out that when we were rehearsing that 3 centuries later, Bertolt Brecht, a personal hero of mine, would be celebrated for precisely this, for alienating the audience, demanding thought over feeling, dismantling illusion in favour of clarity. But in Timon of Athens, Shakespeare was already doing this. This play is loaded with distancing techniques. Characters often remain nameless and serve function rather than fully developed roles. The use of the triptych, those persistent patterns of 3, reinforces points in a way that feels more like a parable or a myth than naturalism. It's not realism, it's a schematic, an allegory, a provocation. The emotional spectrum is intentionally narrow in the play. We're offered only the extremes of friendship and the total absence of it. The dramatic structure repeats and deconstructs itself, a feast of generosity followed by a plea for help, a chorus of rejection, a second feast, this time dripping with venom and satire, a parody of the first, and of the Last Supper. Then exile, then gold, an absurd abundance offered to Timon when Timon no longer wants it. The structure deliberately refuses narrative convention and replaces it with something colder, more mechanical, a parade of visitors to the hermit misanthrope, each changed by their encounter. It's not character development, really. It's ritual. And beneath all of this lies savage political satire. Written during the reign of King James I, a monarch infamous for his lavish spending, gluttony, and the ballooning of England's national debt, Timon holds up a funhouse mirror to its own world. It mocks extravagance. It mocks power. It mocks the very idea that human nature is capable of balance. In doing so, it dares to alienate its audience into thought, long before Brecht made a theory of it. Timon of Athens is often dismissed as minor or incomplete, but I see it as a text crying to be political satire. It's a critique of capitalism's corrosive effects on community and authenticity. His declaration of misanthropy, I hate people, is not just personal bitterness. It's a political statement about the exhaustion and alienation wrought by exploitative systems. It was Damien who pointed out to me this quote from Scripture 1 in 1 Timothy as we were rehearsing. For the love of money is the root of all evil. Those who covet it in place of faith will be pierced through with many sorrows. This may as well be the play in a sentence. We nearly called the play Root, or Timon of Athens, because the idea of root is played upon inside of the text, but we thought I hate people was maybe a better way of selling tickets. Timon is digging for roots in the earth, something to eat when he finds gold in the forest. This feels like a cruel joke of fortune by the gods. That concept of fortune is a very core theme inside of the play. Fortune is fickle, seductive, and cruel. Shakespeare, writing in his patriarchal society, feminizes fortune, following the classical medieval tradition that casts her as a woman. Fortune, in her shift and change of mood, spurns down her late beloved, the poet says in scene 1, who lifts men only to dash them down again. The poet, in the play's opening scene, conjures her image, a lone woman perched on a slippery hill, selecting which men to elevate. It's a rigged lottery, and the rewards come laced with risk. Machiavelli, writing just a century before, argued that fortune could be resisted, that men must use every tool available, including deception and force, to shape the world around them. His vision of a masculine agency, Iago, Edmund, Richard, all Shakespeare's political operators embody this. But Timon is actually a study in the limits of this fantasy. No amount of charisma or cunning could guard against the social violence of abandonment or the gendered irony of being undone by a woman-shaped abstraction. Fortune here isn't just a goddess or a metaphor, she's a warning. Wealth isolates, but its loss reveals something more dangerous, the silence of those who once called themselves friends. And so fortune becomes a test, not of power, but of care, loyalty, and whether we value people beyond what they can offer us. On a global scale, when I first read this text, all I could think about was how relevant it was to the current climate that we live in, between the 1% and the remainder of the world's population. I cast Timon as a contemporary billionaire, controlling and exploiting through generosity. He is the 1% of the 1%, the creme de la creme. In this production, Athens is a city that is in turmoil, financial ruin. It has one man at the center of it that's been controlling such a ridiculous amount of wealth, he even owes the senators money. You want to talk about relevant and contemporary material. The scene in Act 2, Scene 1 of Timon, where the first senator speaks about how much money Timon owes him, is a glorious piece of satire. But how bloody pointed. Corrupt politicians, are you kidding me? But Timon keeps spending his money on crazy stuff. He doesn't need the horses, the Maserati, the golf club. Maseratis are not in the Shakespeare, that's me. He just gives his money away to anyone who asks and pretends to be his friend. Somehow, despite the privilege that exists in our country, we aren't able to provide equally for everyone. And cities like Sydney and Melbourne are becoming havens for the ultra-wealthy. What excuse do we have for people sleeping under bridges in a city that sells houses worth of upwards of $10 million? These are photos from 2025 Sydney. What excuse do we have for seeing such imbalance and letting our society tip increasingly further towards plutocracy? The answer is none. There is something borderline socialist or communist about Timon even. Money to him is like water. It isn't meant to stay in one place, and Timon's philosophy is the right idea. He's immensely generous and truly believes that if he gives widely and he earns love that way, that in his hour of need, his friends will be there. But that kind of thinking doesn't work in the world of late-stage capitalism. Timon gives generously, but all of his friends hoard their wealth to protect themselves, which we see billionaires doing all over the world right now. Quite frankly, to my mind, this play really couldn't be more contemporary if it tried. And yet, I did try. So, when people say they want to make Shakespeare relevant, I cringe. Too often it means superficial modern dressing or snazzy tech in the production with little change to the underlying assumptions that Shakespeare's world was built on: patriarchy, colonialism, and hierarchy. It means very few changes to the actual text and too many scenes where people buzz about on stage with cell phones to make sure we get it. It's relevant. Nevertheless, I did pull Timon into our modern age. Well, 2009. I am most certainly not the first director to bring Shakespeare into the modern time period. I'm not even the first director to bring Timon of Athens into the modern era. But I had a very specific vision when conceptualizing Timon of Athens. In my original Pinterest board pitch thing, I referred to it as Mount Olympus meets the Greek financial crisis. And that is exactly what we have done. As a Cypriot Greek artist myself, the Greek financial crisis was a travesty for my culture. Let's paint a picture of it. This was a time of social and economic decay. There was a 200% rise in inflation, a 40% drop in GDP, not to mention hundreds of suicides related to the crash. It shattered the country, and Greece has not as of yet made anything close to a full recovery. Greek culture often feels like it's all about living for today, and with the austerity measures that were put into place and the devastating impacts of the crisis, almost all of those that are currently homeless in Athens were either victims of the crash or COVID. It feels like perhaps a part of that culture might be gone. How can you live for today when you have enormous debts to pay back to other nations, the IMF, the EU? Something was broken in Greece in those years, and it is yet to be seen if or how the country will find respite. But how are we going to communicate all this? What would Mount Olympus meets the Greek financial crisis actually mean to designers? Well, for me, this design concept was referencing the cyclical nature of financial crises in a capitalistic system. The boom-bust cycle is a pattern Karl Marx famously identified as inherent to capitalism itself. Times of boom, credit's abundant, investments multiply, profits soar, creating an illusion of endless growth. But Marx argued that this expansion inevitably sows the seeds of its own destruction. Overproduction outpaces demand, speculation runs rampant, and contradictions within the system begin to surface. Eventually, the bubble bursts, a crisis hits, markets crash, and the economy contracts sharply. This destructive cycle, Marx believed, wasn't a bug, but a feature of capitalism, a system driven by profit and competition, forever caught in a loop of growth and collapse. Our design, sitting somewhere between modern and ancient, felt like a nod to that. This show could be ancient Athens, or it could be 2009 Greece, because ultimately we're still in similarly destructive cycles. It was in every piece of design from the beginning. I am a firm believer that the first time an audience hears about a show, the performance has begun. I didn't want this to just feel like any production. I wanted it to feel like Timon of Athens was accessible to people my own age. We concepted the marketing around this clashing of ancient and modern, which was a combination of marble images with geometric designs, which became this epic design. If you were buying a ticket to this, I hope you knew you were not being served with your run-of-the-mill roughs and cuff Shakespeare. So that's the marketing, okay, but what about the actual show? Well, what feels more Shakespeare than electronic dance music? Our fabulous composer, A.J. Evans, had one brief, and that was to remix together classic Greek songs with DJ beats that would make any audience member's heart quicken. It was the sound of the show that first came to me as I was sitting in the beautiful Everglades gardens. Yes, I did listen to electronic dance music while sitting in the beautiful Everglades gardens. Similarly, whilst our characters are holding cell phones and accurate to the 2009 time period, each costume has a flair of the ancient inside of it. The senators are evocative of ancient Greece, a little nod to their original context, but still wearing suits. Alone Barnes, our fabulous costume designer, created garments that had contemporary suits with drapes emerging out of them. My personal favourite nod to this design concept is the set design that we have done. I wanted it to feel like Timon was partying upon the ruins of his culture. Perhaps he had such abundant wealth that he was a carer for these ancient places because the government couldn't afford to upkeep them, something we've seen time and time again in recent times. My mother is an archaeologist, so I've spent my life visiting dig sites which are former houses held up by scaffolding of all kinds. In our version, we even watch our partygoers knock over a pillar in order to sit at a table and eat. This is how this ended up rendering at the Lura Everglades Gardens. So you can see the scaffolding there and the ancient ruins surrounding it. I have to credit Jess Lotnick, my associate director on the show, for this one. It was exquisite. In our new version, Rose Montgomery is taking over to do a redesign for the York Theatre at the Seymour Centre. I'm not going to show you that one here today, though, because you'll have to buy a ticket to come and see it. After Act 2, we replaced the famous cave that Timon escapes to in the original script with a gesture towards a tent city. This is a nod towards the destitution that we're seeing on the outskirts of almost every single major city today. I presented images of LA, London, and so on. I was living in London for a period and couldn't believe how confronted I was with the destitution and poverty in every tube station that I walked through. Timon becomes impoverished and he returns to nature and lives a life of destitution. We've created a contemporary frame here with all of these design elements that have helped us to connect with how relevant and contemporary this story is and can be, and recontextualizes it for a modern audience. So we've got the design, but the play was still unfinished. So Damien and I decided to do something radical and add an ending to a Shakespeare play. Suddenly, I'd gone from not ever wanting to do Shakespeare to writing my name next to him in the writing credits, which felt a little bit like scribbling your name on the Mona Lisa. It is worth mentioning here that the unfinished quality of the play has also brought about conjecture of the co-authorship of it. When you read it, you can pretty well tell that the scenes were written by which scenes were written by Shakespeare and which ones were written by this mysterious person. The versification is quite different at some points, and by different, I mean some of it's quite bad. Modern technology and analysis has made the conclusion that Thomas Middleton is the most likely candidate. Middleton was the popular writer of city comedies, a genre of domestic socio-political intrigue and satire which Shakespeare never really delved into. These pieces had an approach to characterization that entirely removed romance, family, and marriage from the story. Timon is the only play in the folio that features not a single marriage or familial relationship. We don't know where he comes from, or who his family is, or who he's interested in. There is not really much existing proof that Middleton was actually the co-author, but he's widely accepted as such, and therefore is credited as such in our production. So, what did Damien and I actually do to adapt it? Well, aside from combining a number of scenes and characters to streamline the play for clarity and make it more dynamic, the biggest change is our added ending. I wanted the gold that Timon finds in the tent city in the woods to mean something. I couldn't bear that he just died and that was it. I wanted it to be reminiscent of the consequences placed onto Greece when the EU, IMF, and European Central Bank imposed austerity measures in exchange for bailout loans amounting to over 260 billion euros across 3 programs in 2010, 2012, and 2015. These austerity conditions included deep cuts to public spending, pensions and wages, tax increases, and privatisation of state assets. The goal was to reduce the budget deficit and restore market confidence. But the effect on ordinary Greeks was devastating. Unemployment soared, peaking at over 27% in 2013. Poverty increased, and public services, especially health and education, were severely strained. Many critics, including economists and even IMF reports, later argued that these measures exacerbated the recession rather than helping recovery, effectively punishing the Greek population for systemic issues and creditor miscalculations. It became a defining example of how financial crisis management in the Eurozone prioritised fiscal discipline over social stability. So, in our adaptation of the play's final act, we have utilised and extended Timon's will and testament, which is how the play initially ends, leaving Athens with both a curse and a source of hope: gold. He's giving the lot to them, but as a loan. Timon passes on the terrible debt and destruction it brings with it as a root of human greed and evil. We created this language by pulling quotes from a number of other Shakespeare plays. It's amazing how much you can find in the folios that speaks to wealth and money. The huge wealth Timon finds during his destitution is left to the beasts of Athens with the threat of loan and interest, and the city will need to start again, find a way to cooperate and participate, or fall forever, losing its cultural architecture in the process. This was Timon of Athens with a new boldness and a new ending. But I said I wasn't just going to talk about boldness in approaching Shakespeare's canon, I was also going to talk about feminism. So allow me here to pivot. Feminism is categorically not an add-on in my work. It is the foundation of what drives everything I do. I've been privileged enough in my life to work as an advocate for some of Australia's most major organisations, most particularly Plan International, the largest charity for women and girls in the world. I've spoken on every topic in public forums, from vaccines to online safety. I've sat with real victims, listened to their stories, and I believe my understanding of feminism is rooted deeply in all my work. I know that very unfortunately, feminism has become a dirty word in so many circles, and it's why I intentionally use it on this speech tonight. I know buckets of people that would never describe themselves as feminists, but if you press them about gender equality, they would say they are absolutely in favour of it. I don't need to tell all of you, since you're the kinds of people that come to a lecture on a rainy Tuesday night, but newsflash, gender equality and feminism are the same thing. Okay, Margaret, we get it. You're a feminist, everyone knows that. But what on earth does that have to do with Timon of Athens again? Well, we hate to break it to you, Margaret, but Timon is all about men. That is correct. Timon, in its original form, has only 2 women in it, Timandra and Phrynia, who are both sex workers that Alcibiades brings to Timon in the forest. They're in one scene. They are depicted as wanting nothing but gold. Yep, that's right. Timon has basically no women in it, and the ones that are in it are pretty terrible and totally one-dimensional. So why did I even want to give it a second glance? And my answer to you is this. Timon isn't really about men. It's about capitalism and patriarchal systems that do not work. The 2018 Swan Theatre production in Stratford-upon-Avon of Timon famously cast Catherine Hunter in the role of Timon. I thought really seriously about making Timon a woman, but it felt wrong to me. The utter misanthropy and childishness when he doesn't get his way only felt right in the hands of a male performer. Sorry, Damien. Timon reminded me of what I imagine happens when Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos doesn't get their way. He throws a tantrum, punishes everyone around him. No, I want it to be more clever than this. So, the heart and soul of this production is Timon's steward, or accountant in our version, Flavius. In our production, we've renamed her Flavia, and she is portrayed by the inimitable Deb Galanos. This character is there for Timon from the first moments of the play. Social reproduction theory highlights how capitalism depends not only on waged labour, but also on the unwaged invisible labour, mostly done by women, that sustains life and labour itself. It argues that housework, childcare, elder care, and emotional support are essential for the reproduction of the workforce, yet these tasks are systemically undervalued and excluded from economic analysis. I am only bringing this up because in my production of Timon, the people around him, all his servants, are women. It's really important that we see a picture of this man being held up by a group of very strong women. And his core star for Flavia is the channel for all women who have been trying to take care of a man who didn't have emotional intelligence. It enrages my feminist senses. And the fact that Flav is not a love interest, but simply a woman trying to do her job and care for Timon even when he doesn't listen to her and can no longer pay her, and she still keeps doing it because that's what women do, is one of my favourite things about this production. Casting Deb, one of Australia's finest Greek actors, next to Damien's Anglo-Timon had a doubling effect on this dynamic. A Greek woman trying to wrangle her Anglo boss into not behaving in a destructive way towards her city and her culture felt really important to the underlying subtext of the show. So, with that in mind, it's worth taking a little bit of time to talk about the approach to process that we took in making Timon of Athens. When you say theatre, feminist theatre, people assume that it's like that Janelle Monáe video, or just like one woman yelling on stage at a chair for 90 minutes. And to be fair, sometimes it is. But I'm talking about feminist practice in theatre making, which is also an important part of how we should approach the canon. I often think directors don't think about the dramaturgy of process, and I've been so grateful to work with and for some that have. They have taught me everything I know. If you're doing a piece about climate change, maybe your entire set shouldn't be made of unsustainable materials. If you're doing a play about equality, maybe everyone on the team should get paid equal wages. If you're doing a piece about the problems inside of capitalism via a feminist lens, then maybe you should create a space where the ideas are valued more than expensive props and people can collaborate properly and safely. Timon of Athens was a truly collaborative process, particularly when it came to the movement work inside of the show. Each day we would come in and make new changes and images and ideas based on references or videos or general thoughts we'd had over the previous day doing the scene work. Then, over a period of time, I stitched together our choreography based on AJ's tracks. Timon opens and closes with a 6-minute movement sequence, which is almost exactly the same choreography at the beginning and end of the play, just with different contexts. At one end, the choreography speaks to opulence, party culture, orgies, excess. At the other end, it speaks to destitution and despair. This was designed to reiterate the cyclical nature of the financial cycle, which I referred to earlier. Working in this collaborative way and allowing for devising inside of a Shakespeare process can inherently dismantle our dismissal of his work as nothing but Western patriarchal canonical rubbish. We can apply new processes that give these pieces new meanings. The process models the social change we seek: shared power, flatter structures, respect and care. I believe directing is partly facilitation, a sharing of power and creative agency with your performers. Doesn't mean I'm not specific or sometimes demanding, a mistake that often gets made when female directors start to talk about flattening hierarchy. But it does mean that I am open. There are other things that I do for my process that is specifically designed to be a reimagining of the traditional process. I write a manifesto to each cast, explaining and outlining the process so that they can mentally prepare before they come in. I do one-on-one individual sessions with each cast member before rehearsal to deepen the bond between myself and the actor. Every rehearsal begins with a well-being check to make sure that I know where everyone's at each day. I actually intentionally wear bright, bold colours. I wear makeup, skirts, feminine style clothing to remind my teams that positive leadership doesn't just look one way. I've been intentionally doing this particular one my entire career, so I had to get it in there. It doesn't matter what our female directors are wearing or if they have a baby in their arms, their capacity to hold the room is still the same. I know to all of you that might seem like an obvious thing, but you'd be surprised by some of the accidental tropes our industry is still falling into today. Each day, I remind my team that I'm there to support them, which might sound like woo-woo, nonsense, Gen Z stuff, but the difference to well-being that it can make is quite astounding. The trope of the difficult actor is one that I've been working to dismantle ever since I started. This is not to say there are not difficult colleagues of mine, but it is to say that often actors live in fear of asking the wrong question or questioning a directorial choice because they are worried it makes them seem irritable or not on board. But any good director has an answer for their choices. At the end of every process, each individual is invited for a debriefing process where they can give me feedback from having been inside a room I've been facilitating. Each one of these things on their own seems either obvious or so small it's barely noticeable. And none of these are my original thoughts, but a collection of watching great people lead. But actually across a whole process, the difference that it makes is huge. In the end, these choices, however small they seem, accumulate into something powerful. They shift the culture of the rehearsal room and ultimately of the work itself. Feminist theatre making isn't just about what's on stage, it's about how we get to it. It's about modelling the world we want to live in by the way in which we create. By centering care, collaboration, transparency, shared authorship. We don't just make better art, we make human art, and that to me is the most radical act of all in Timon. Okay, Margaret, so you've got a production that is speaking to how bad capitalism is. You're even commenting on the patriarchy through your casting and your process, but isn't this all a bit doom and gloomy? No. This is a story that speaks to us both on a global socio-political level, which at this moment feels quite gloomy, but that holds that proto-Brechtian distancing technique, but it also somehow manages to burrow under the skin of what it means to be human. It's not only Timon's anti-capitalist warning, but also its humanism that makes this script special and worth pursuing. I would argue that every single human being on Earth can relate to Timon in some way. Maybe you've never flung literal feces at your dinner guests, but you've probably had a moment where your popularity felt conditional. Like when you get a promotion and suddenly people are buying you coffee and laughing at your PowerPoint jokes or whatever. But deep down, you suspect it's less about your charisma and more about your proximity to that corner office. I don't know why I put that corner office thing in there. I've never seen a corner office in my life. I'm an artist. We've all visited that little emotional cave, wondering if things went south, who actually would still be there for us? If you were seriously ill or broke or no longer useful, would your so-called network show up? Would they quietly mute your Instagram stories? Kids demonstrate this beautifully. The second someone brings in a new toy, the newest Barbie, everyone's their best friend. The difference is adults are just better at pretending that they're not doing exactly the same thing. We call it networking and pretend it's noble, but often it's just a grown-up version of can I play with your toy? Timon's journey is extreme, sure. He goes like full burn it all down, misanthrope, but there's something heartbreakingly recognizable in it. His rage, his grief, his disillusionment with transactional relationships, it's timeless. And maybe a little funny too, because Shakespeare kind of knew that when people disappoint you, sometimes all you can do is rant to the trees. To explore this concept of friendship and its true nature, Shakespeare and Middleton create a crazy plethora of characters. This is my breakdown of them all. That's me trying to fit them all into 12 people. And you can see how many characters each person plays. They give Timon 3 clear friends, Alcibiades, Epaminondas, and Flavia, but otherwise Timon is surrounded by faceless, nameless lords and ladies that are sitting around his dining table, filling the halls of his extravagant parties. This couldn't be more relevant to the social media age. We've all got hundreds or thousands of online followers and friends, but how many of those people do you ever actually see? Are we just connecting? Are we really connecting with anyone, or are we just filling our heads with TikToks and cute panda videos? In this world, we can block, ban, or unfriend in an instant. It doesn't have consequences. Gen Z is a lonely generation, a group of young people that has been found to have less social interaction and less sex than their predecessors were. There is something in this text about false friendship that speaks directly to us. True friendship is measured by way of those that are still there for Timon. They try to pull him out of the bog, but they can't. He has determined death is his only option, for he hates people. Those 3 true friends in the play appear in all 5 acts and are the counterpoint to the world Timon grows to hate. And despite his merciless hatred of them too, they never let go of him. He doesn't realize it, but he is loved. That is the real tragedy of the piece. Philosophically, the core of this play is trying to tear down the concept of utter misanthropy and nihilism. Timon's approach to death is extreme. His most profound decision is, of course, to die. For him, the acceptance of death becomes the only rational response to the irrational world he lives in. It's one of the few acts a person can truly claim as their own. Timon's final words reflects this with stark clarity. Graves only be men's works and death their gain. This questioning of existence is a theme in Shakespeare's work, his most famous line, to be or not to be, being a direct reference to it. Makes you wonder exactly when the play was written, which in this case is actually somewhat a matter of conjecture. What I'd give to grab a time machine and find out what was going for him when he wrote this. I mean, was he okay? There's so much debate around when it was written, with some proposing it was between 1605 and 1607, when some of his greatest works were written that also draw on sources such as Plutarch's historical essays on Mark Antony, Coriolanus, and of course Alcibiades, who appears in Timon. Was it written in tandem with King Lear in 1606, which explores similar ideas of ingratitude, misanthropy, beggary, homelessness, and even gets to the point of stripping down of a once powerful figure into the wasteland or the forest? Likewise, Coriolanus, also 1606, explores the military threat of a banished and loathed war hero turning upon the city he once served, as Alcibiades does in his play. I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that we have Coriolanus, King Lear, and Timon all on in the same year, and what that's saying about the current moment, our need to use Shakespeare to dissect these powerful men and their responses to the crises they face, feels rather pointed to me. These tales from Plutarch unquestionably gripped Shakespeare's imagination and generated several of his plays. Other scholars argue that it's Shakespeare's last play. Its unfinished script resounds somewhat with the playwright's death. Interestingly, the curse of Timon's grave in the original text, which isn't really in ours, but it does have interesting parallels with the inscription on Will Shakespeare's grave in Stratford. Unlike Hamlet, though, Timon bypasses philosophical hand-wringing and gets straight to work. Grabs a shovel, spends most of the last act literally digging his own grave. It's a bold theatrical gesture, part burial, part performance, part protest. He also is composing his epitaph and drafting his will, all with grim determination, only interrupted by the unwelcome intrusion of visitors. For Timon, this grave isn't just a hole in the ground. It's the one thing he can shape and control. Tellingly, he digs it on the beached verge of the salt flood, where the ocean will wash over his gravestone daily. As Damien pointed out through our rehearsals, he's not simply choosing death, he's seeking total erasure. No legacy, no name, no remembrance. He wants to disappear so completely that even the sea shouldn't be able to find where he lay. Damien said this fabulous thing about Timon. When the true goal is non-being, death is the first and easiest step. It's a profound misreading to assume that Timon of Athens advocates nihilism, or that Timon's descent into misanthropy amounts to a declaration that life is meaningless and we may as well surrender to despair. In truth, the play argues for something far more nuanced and paradoxically more hopeful. From the outset, we're introduced to Epaminondas, played by the extraordinary Mike Booth, the cynic, philosopher, and provocateur, positioned as the intellectual irritant of the piece. He holds an oppositional stance to the values in Timon's court, acting as a moral counterweight and a gadfly to the sycophants. It's tempting to assume, particularly given the play's title, I Hate People, that this bleak worldview belongs to him. But that is the play's greatest sleight of hand. In reality, Epaminondas is not the avatar of hopelessness, but its antidote. His relentless antagonism is not born of apathy, but of concern for Timon. He believes, perhaps naively, that Timon might still be rescued from his self-destructive spiral. His presence in the play is not to reinforce Timon's worldview, but to challenge it, to insist that something in life is still worth engaging with, even if it is only our suffering. His final line in the original text encapsulates this beautifully for me and remains the most poignant to me in the entire play. Live and love thy misery. It's not an exhortation to wallow, but a recognition that to feel deeply, even in pain, is to be alive. It's not despair, but a form of radical acceptance. And within that, there is undeniably hope. Life is a messy, complicated, difficult thing. I know that better than anyone. I work in the theatre. But there is always hope of the possibility of great progress and change. I think a contemporary audience knows that better than anyone. We have in recent years lived through pandemics, global crises, wars, dictatorships all over the world. We're still living through it, and there's more to come. And yet, the human experience is to continue through, to survive and thrive through all. The play is not an advertisement for misanthropy, but a fable-like warning against it. We might all relate to Timon, but that doesn't mean we should follow him. The title of this speech was one of Epaminondas' lines, "I wonder men dare trust themselves with men." But of course we do, because that's what life is all about, connecting to each other. So, what does everything I've said tell us about our approach to Shakespeare in general? Well, it tells us that our relationship with Shakespeare shouldn't be reverent for its own sake. It should be bold, interrogative, and personal. Shakespeare doesn't need protecting. He needs provoking. His plays aren't museum pieces. They're living texts that demand that we hold them up to the light of the present and ask, what do you have to say to us now? If the answer is not much, then it's our job as makers to dig deeper or to rewrite the question entirely. It reminds us that the canon is not sacred. Timon of Athens proves that even Shakespeare had rough drafts, failures, and unfinished thoughts. So why treat every word as untouchable? If he adapted myths and rewrote histories, then we can and should do the same to him. The canon isn't a tomb, it's a workshop where we can apply feminist, queer, intersectional, any other type of practice we want to. It means asking not just how we stage Shakespeare, but why. Why this play? Why now? Who benefits from preserving it as is? And who gets excluded? We've learned that relevance comes from a radical interpretation, not tradition. This Timon, a billionaire in freefall, a society on the brink, a mashup of Greek tragedy and EDM rave, didn't modernize Shakespeare. It unleashed the text's buried political rage and made it roar into the present. This is what the canon demands of us now. Not mimicry, but argument. Not homage, but transformation. And finally, it tells us to stop treating Shakespeare as the final word and start treating him as the beginning of a conversation. The canon only matters if we make it matter. If someone who never wanted to direct Shakespeare can find their voice in one of his strangest, least loved plays, then that's the point. It opens the gaps and the fractures that we find the most space for reinvention. I didn't choose Timon of Athens because I revered Shakespeare. I chose it because it was unfinished, because it made space for boldness, resistance, and cultural specificity in the way a modern play never could. This production didn't just stage the play, it dismantled it, reassembled it, and used it as a platform to speak truth to power. In doing so, we made Shakespeare our own, feminist, political, collaborative, and anti-capitalist. And maybe that's what makes this story worth telling, that someone who thought they had no place in the canon found a home in its messiest margins and built something brand new there. So please, be bold, create freely, and above all, love thy misery. Thank you.